Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we looked at the near-perfect Angler's Tunnel, which was really only held back by an underwhelming boss battle. Today, we're heading into Catfish's Maw, but before we head inside, there's a small handful of pre-dungeon things to talk about, so let's hop into it. Unlike the last handful of dungeons, the path to Catfish's Maw is pretty minimal. This is the game giving us an opportunity to engage with its bountiful supply of side content by steering us away from the dungeon for a moment. And with so much of Koholint available for us to explore, there's plenty we can choose to do. Before we can head into the dungeon, we'll at least need to help this ghost, though I do think that this part is a little too cryptic in the original version. The ghost will straight up ask us to take it home in the remake, which might be a little too heavy-handed, but in the original, it just follows you around making this creepy, haunting noise. I could see this genuinely confusing new players, not knowing how to get rid of this creepy ghost. So this is definitely a good addition to the remake to at least give the players an idea of where to go, though the text could be dialed down a little bit. Unfortunately, we don't really have a happy medium. We have one version that's too cryptic and the other that's a little too direct. Oh well. That said, I definitely recommend taking the opportunity to interact with all of the side content that you can at this point. The dungeon entrance itself is easy to get to, so it'll be there, but we're given some time to breathe. And I think that serves the game's overall pacing very well. Aside from that, once we've helped this ghost out returning to its home, and then its grave, we're free to enter the dungeon at our leisure. We can do so by using our recently acquired flippers to dive through this underwater passageway. So with all of that said, let's head into the dungeon. Welcome to Catfish's Maw, Link's Awakening's largest dungeon yet. And it's pretty dang good. This dungeon has a heavy exploration focus with lots of crisscrossing, forks in the road, and rooms that we'll have to revisit multiple times. But before we get into that, let's just quickly talk about the dungeon music. First thing to note is that this is the game's first dungeon theme, aside from the color dungeon, that doesn't reference or incorporate the cave motif at all, which I'm okay with. We're into the second half of the game's dungeons now, and something a little different is welcome. The track has this great feeling of tension that never really lets up, mostly by using a bass line that fades in and out, adding a sort of disorienting feeling to the track, with little phrases thrown in to keep it all grounded and interesting. This is a prime example of game music being perfectly tailored for the hardware it's on. The Game Boy has a pretty limited range of sounds that it can make, but this song works within those limitations and creates something genuinely tense, like danger is always just around the corner. It's a great piece, and as you'd expect, the remake faithfully updates the track, using elements from the original while also incorporating modern instrumentation to give it some extra oomph. Which is more in line with how the first 3 dungeons updated their music compared to how Angler's Tunnel took more creative liberties. There's not much more I can really say about this that I haven't already about the previous dungeon themes, but it really is masterfully done, and the choices of instrumentation are perfect. perfect. That rising and falling tension is captured so well here, with elements of intrigue sprinkled throughout it. It's a great piece of dungeon music. In terms of aesthetics, Catfish's Maw opts for a fairly naturalistic approach in both versions. The whole place has a sandy floor with puddles and little streams of water, with stone floor tiles being used sparingly, and typically meant to direct the player towards specific points of interest. Though they have once again reused the same stone wall texture that we saw back in Tail Cave, as well as a great deal of normal caves, though this time with a purplish hue. The same can be said with DX, which uses the same wafer cookie walls, though a little browner than purple. I do appreciate that the remake adds some plant life here and there as accents to highlight that naturalistic look even more, though I do wish they'd taken the idea just a bit further here and there. For the most part, I'm glad they kept the layouts and floor plans as one-to-one with the original as possible, but in cases like these little streams of water and puddles, them being so square feels a little strange. It's easy to overlook on the Game Boy. Everything is on a grid and in a pixel art style, so streams of water and puddles being perfectly square isn't that out of place. But in the remake's art style, it looks pretty strange for the water to have corners like that. I guess I would have just liked for them to have rounded it out a bit more, just to make it look a little bit more natural. With the exception of this room, the water here in all versions is purely for aesthetic. It has no impact on the gameplay, so changing it like that wouldn't harm anything. But that's a pretty minor nitpick. Otherwise, I think they did a great job of updating this dungeon for the remake. It looks great. The dungeon progression is overall very well designed, especially considering it lacks a core central room from which the navigation can all branch away from. Instead, we have lots of branching paths and forks in the road, with rooms often being reachable but not fully explorable without the dungeon item or necessary keys, the usual trimmings of a navigationally focused dungeon. At times, this place can be downright labyrinthian, which for me is a lot of fun. I swear I haven't had to lean on using the map and compass to keep track of my progress this heavily since the water temple in Ocarina of Time. Especially towards the end of the dungeon, using the compass to seek out treasure chests and keys ends up being vital. There are also multiple stairways and underground passageways to connect distant areas. To be more precise, there are 4 of these passageways, and by extension, 8 staircases. Well, 7 staircases and 1 pool of water. If I'm being honest, I'm not a huge fan of these. I find it tends to make the navigation feel less natural and makes the layout feel disjointed in a way. It's almost certainly a byproduct of them trying to maintain the dungeon shape, but it feels like a band-aid solution to me. I can usually look past 1 or 2 of these, but 4 is bordering on excessive. And honestly, at times it undermines how useful the map is when you can't reliably use said map to plot out a path to certain rooms. In the remake, this is definitely alleviated by the ability to leave pins in the map, so you can note for yourself which staircases connect to each other. In fact, it ends up being invaluable to do so, but in the case of the original, which does not have a dedicated map screen, this corner of your pause menu is all you get. Don't get me wrong, I like the dungeon being so exploration heavy. I just don't love the way these passageways make the layout feel nonsensical and disjointed. Come to think of it, it's more or less the same complaint I had with some of A Link to the Past's dungeons and their over-reliance on teleport paths. So for the sake of being constructive, here's an idea on how I would improve that. Either move the connected rooms to be right next to each other instead of way across the dungeon, dungeon, or take out those stairways entirely and just have the rooms connected to each other properly with standard doors. We could also take the approach that they did with Key Cavern, and instead of having underground passageways that don't even appear on the map, just incorporate a second floor into the dungeon floor plan that these stairways could connect to and from. I think all of these suggestions would of course require the dungeon to not be so boxed in by the dungeon shape. In this case, I guess it's supposed to be shaped like a catfish, right? With his mouth open. My point is that, like Bottle Grotto, the level designers trying to maintain the dungeon shape seems to be what holds this dungeon back. And I really think that if they hadn't done it this way, that it would elevate this from a very good dungeon to an excellent one. But that's just me. And since that isn't what we got, then I'll just have to reiterate that the use of map markers in the remake is going to improve the overall experience greatly. Like Angler's Tunnel, this dungeon also uses the old treasure chest tease to a great effect, constantly having you walk past treasures that you can see but can't quite reach. I've talked a lot about this concept at length when examining Angler's Tunnel already, so I won't dwell on it a ton more here, aside from saying that it plays into that satisfaction once we do have the dungeon item, because at that point when we do get it, we'll have been able to visit quite literally every room that has a treasure chest. And in essence, this dungeon uses bottomless pits as an obstacle in much the same way that Angler's Tunnel did with its deep water. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the way you actually obtain the dungeon item in the first place, because this dungeon does something pretty interesting with that. The dungeon has two mid-bosses, but it's the first one that we're concerned with for the moment, the Master Stalfos. The fights with him are not incredible in and of themselves. He's fought pretty much the same way that you fight regular Stalfos knights, wherein you need to wait for the right moment to strike with your sword, and then bomb him when he's collapsed. Nothing spectacular, though honestly I think he looks pretty dang cool. What's more interesting is the level of intelligence that he seems to display. First off, he has apparently stolen the dungeon item from the chest where you would typically find it, which is a nice little moment that subverts your usual expectations. There are 4 empty rooms throughout the dungeon, each noted with a number of special tiles or blocks depending on the version to indicate the order in which he'll appear in each room. Long story short, there's something of a wild goose chase happening here. As we'll fight him in each room in sequence, he will flee after a certain point, and we'll need to hunt him down to fight him again. I like that we can actually find the empty room number 4 first, and then encounter him in room number 1, with room number 2 being pretty close by as well. Hopefully with all of that context, players can piece together what they need to do. I like this concept overall, and that they don't use objective markers to point you towards each of the rooms in order, but instead leave it up to the players to explore and piece it together for themselves. And I don't think we've gotten a dungeon scenario quite like this ever again. If every dungeon did this, then I think the concept would wear a bit thin. But this being something unique to Catfish's Maw works for me, and gives the dungeon its own gimmick to build its progression around. And just to reiterate, as we explore and hunt him down, we're passing by all of these out-of-reach treasure chests. They're just sitting there, taunting us. Once he's defeated for good, we'll get to the dungeon item that he stole. And yup, it's the hookshot. My beloved. There's a reason this thing is a fan favorite item in just about every game that features it. It's so fun. In the context of this dungeon though, it's put to particularly good use. Now we can cross all of those bottomless pits to reach new areas and open those treasure chests that we couldn't reach before. It can be used to retrieve items, pull on these extendable bridges, and makes fighting certain enemies, such as these Helmosaurs, much easier by removing their masks. Like I said about the Pegasus boots, the dungeon item both feels is extremely useful and makes the player feel like they've grown more powerful, since it has use cases for puzzles, exploration, and even combat. It's a great item, I'll never stop praising it. Speaking of using the hookshot for combat, let's talk about the second mid-boss. It's a pair of Gomas. Goma is a classic enemy that I'm always happy to see return, and they look great here. Though it's interesting that they change from green and black in the DX version to red in the remake. But either way, this is a nice classic look for Goma. I'm all about it. Goma is the one boss type that gets a pass from me for having a big eyeball weak point. You can fight them using the hookshot or the bow if you purchased it already by this point. Strangely, from my testing at least, the bow seems to be more effective in Link's Awakening DX, as you can deal more damage directly, while in the remake, the hookshot actually ends up being more effective, as instead of dealing damage itself, it stuns Goma, letting you get multiple hits in with your sword, and therefore dealing more damage overall. In either case, it's a good mid-boss, but I think I like the remake's version a little better, since the pairing of the hookshot and sword ends up feeling like a bit more of a strategic fight that keeps you mindful of your positioning, since you have to get close to attack while they're stunned and then quickly retreat. The final note I want to make here is about getting the boss key, which is tucked in this room, which we can reach through this underwater passageway. While I have been pretty critical of the use of these passageways, at least this one is visually distinct from the others, and therefore more memorable as a point of interest that will draw players back once they have the dungeon item. I just think it would have been more effective if it was the only one of these passageways, or if they used other landmarks for this moment. But alas, it is still quite the satisfying moment to be able to extend this bridge and finally grab that boss key. So with all of that said and done, we can hookshot across this gap and confront the dungeon boss. After a quick introduction, the boss will burst through the floor and walls, revealing itself. This is the Slime Eel, though he's not quite as slimy as, say, Slime Eye, so he's a bit of a pain if I'm being honest. The boss itself exists mostly out of bounds in the arena, with his spiky tail protruding out of the hole in the center of the floor. It'll spin around, so you've got to carefully avoid that. All the while, he'll poke his face through the holes in the walls to try and chomp at you. What we've got to do is fire the hookshot into his mouth to yank him from the wall, revealing his neck as his weak spot. Sounds simple, but he has 4 potential positions. The window of timing to use the hookshot is also pretty short, and sometimes he even fakes you out. Maybe it's just me, but I have trouble avoiding his tail for whatever reason. I think I get too focused in on trying to stay aligned with the holes in the wall that I forget to tuck out of the way of his tail in time. That's probably just on me, let's be real. It's never so much of an issue where I end up dying, but enough of one that I leave the fight with some serious damage. Still, this is a pretty decent boss battle, one which makes very good use of the dungeon item in conjunction with your sword. I like that the hookshot pulls the boss towards you rather than just stunning him in place. That's good stuff, and makes it a little different than Goma. Plus, having to be mindful of your positioning and actually avoid the boss's attacks is a bit refreshing after the gallery of very easy bosses that we've had in Slime Eye, the Hard Hit Beetle, and the Anglerfish, all of whom were absurdly easy. So this is a welcome change of pace in my books. After some interesting dialogue, he will perish, we'll get our heart container as usual, and of course we'll get the Wind Marimba, the 5th instrument of the siren needed to awaken the Windfish. So overall, Catfish's Maw is a very good dungeon, which leans heavily into the big tangled knot feeling that I have praised so much in the past. Though it doesn't feel quite as polished as, say, Angler's Tunnel, it does deliver on being a satisfying dungeon to navigate with a heavy focus on dungeon item utility. The hookshot has use cases in nearly every single room, whether it be by making enemies easier to fight or by having large gaps that you need to cross, either by pulling Link across directly or by using the hookshot to extend these bridges. It is masterfully implemented here, though the over-reliance on those underground passageways does at times hold the dungeon back, and I really feel it's another case of the designers having put themselves in too much of a box by adhering to that dungeon shape. Had they abandoned the shape and made the layout less disjointed, then it might be one of the best dungeons in the game, but as it stands, there are just too many of these passageways, which muddles up the navigation. Do we really need 2 of them to lead towards the boss door? Even still, the dungeon has a strong gameplay identity, having a clear objective of hunting down the Master Stalfos, previewing nearly the entire dungeon as we do so, then being rewarded for our efforts with the hookshot, allowing us to reach everything that we couldn't before, which after all of those little teases delivers on a strong sense of satisfaction. Though I think it would have been pretty cool if the Master Stalfos battles were a little more challenging, though the Gomas do make up for that. Still, I'd rather they prioritize a mechanically sound dungeon over a tough mid-boss any day, and they absolutely deliver in that respect. The dungeon really feels like a mini Metroidvania, just with how much stuff you pass by and then later can access once you have the hookshot. So while there are a few small issues with the overall layout, this dungeon still manages to offer a great sense of exploration and player satisfaction. I like it quite a lot. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. Thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery, and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.